Anyways, today we're talking about Azaleas by Conrad von Stichtenstein der Jüngste. That's a completely fictitious name. There's a nice picture of azaleas in case you're not sure what they look like. Um, they they are members of the rhododendron family. This is a picture in Nepal. They grow all over the world, Asia. There's a lot in Turkey. Lots of different subspecies. It's a very diverse crop. There are a few major ones that are used for ornamental crop production. Um, but like I always say, go back to the original locations, and we're talking mountains, Himalayas, and in North America, actually, the Appalachian Mountains. There's a lot of azaleas. I think there's a history behind that. It was like some senator a long time ago brought them back, and they have sort of naturalized, and they're a big deal. A lot of places in the southern states like to grow azaleas or in their gardens. So, anyways, in mountain, we're talking cooler climates, more moisture. You get all the rainfall from clouds, good drainage because the soil's sort of shallow, less developed, so not rich soil, and acid loving. We're going to get back to that. Um, Here's a little factoid. Azaleas are poisonous. Yes, as are rhododendrons, but azaleas are quite poisonous. Eating any part of the plant in small quantities, like it says here, life-threatening. One flower will give you ulcers in your mouth and you'll probably vomit. Eat a couple more flowers and leaves and you have abbreviated your life. Mad honey is an interesting thing. There was actually quite a few incidences in Turkey where people are eating honey from apiaries that were placed near gardens that had lots of azaleas. And that is something to be aware of, especially in the southern states where they grow a lot of azaleas in their gardens. You want to know you're not eating honey that's been made from where bees have harvested from azaleas. So, and then twisted or what, in the 1800s, if you really didn't like someone, you would give them cut azaleas in a black vase. And that was basically a veiled death threat. Weird. So azaleas are a long crop. There's really only one or two growers in Niagara that grow azaleas, but there's a lot around the world. It's still a major crop. A lot of them are down in, go figure, southern states where it's really popular. You're looking at like a 3-year crop. So you're going to take your cuttings, you're going to root them, you're going to make sure they don't set flower because you don't want to waste energy. And then you repeat that for another year. And the third year, you're going to kick them into bloom and then sell them. Prices are all over the map. So this is still a viable business. They go for anywhere from $15 to $50 for a 6 to 8 inch pot. And then there's the whole nursery field where they're growing for features in gardens. They're worth a lot of money. Fairly hardy. They are an evergreen. I forgot to mention that. So they keep their leaves all winter, which is kind of nice. Hardy zone 6 through 9. Zone 4. Some varieties. It's a pretty broad family. So pH, again, going to keep coming back to that, but they like acidic soil. They're like our hydrangeas, like rhododendrons, that kind of stuff. They're blueberries. They're all acid-loving plants. So fertilizers, things like 2177 are acidifying. So when the plant feeds on them, they will produce their own acid. If using rainwater, you can use slightly less acidic fertilizer because the carbon dioxide naturally makes carbonic acid. I don't know if you can see that. My face seems to be blocking that, but this is a zonal map. Hard to see Lake Ontario in the midst of all the colors, but that's zone 5 is around where we are. On the Buffalo side, it dips into the 4 because they get all the snow and whatnot. Kitchener-Waterloo area is more 4, but we're a borderline for some of these varieties. Actually, it's common. Oh, apparently I can't go backwards. Azaleas often freeze out buds in Ontario gardens, if they're planted outside. So people will complain that, oh, I put an azalea, it flowered first year really well, and then after that we didn't have a lot of flowers. And that's primarily because the borderline zonal thing and the buds not surviving the winter. So they'll grow, they'll be green, you might have a few buds, but not a full flush, depending on how the previous year went. So production summary, there's root, grow, and then pinch, and then ultimately initiate buds. Then you have to go through a dormancy, and interestingly, it's yet again 1,000 hours. We've seen that a couple of times now. Easter lilies, hydrangeas. There seems to be a conserved mechanism in plants that dormancy requires about 1,000 hours to overcome, and then force the plants into flower with simulating a spring, arrival of spring, that kind of thing. And if you're curious, Minecraft has azaleas. At least that's what I think they are. Propagating terminal cuttings. I think we mentioned this in the class, right? Taking internode cuttings versus terminal. Internodes are just not worth it. You have to reinitiate a new apical. There's a delay. You end up with a really uneven bunch of plants. So apical or terminal is the way to go. Always harvest cuttings from plants that are actively growing. So they're going to be taking the time of year when the plants are growing. So through the warmer summer months, strip off some of the leaves. We don't need that liability. Plus, you're going to be jamming into the soil, and if the leaves are below the soil, they're going to rot, and that's just an opportunity for disease. Interesting thing, which is, I think, blocked a bit by this picture, when you take a cutting on a semi or a woody cutting, you scrape away about 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters, depending on the cutting, of bark. And what that does is, when you take a cutting, you're exposing the meristematic tissue, which is where you're going to have callus formation and root development. But if it's a thin cut, there's only a little bit of meristematic tissue exposed. So by scraping a chunk off the side, you have a much longer exposed meristematic region. So you have better root production, essentially. Not only that, roots are not just coming off the bottom, they're coming off the side of the stem, so it will populate the soil quicker. And basically same sort of stuff, warm temperatures in the root zone to encourage rooting. So base heat is always helpful. Vegetative growth typically happens through the summer into early fall. High nitrogen. That doesn't mean like lots of fertilizer. It just means like relative to other nutrients, nitrogen is more abundant. That encourages bulking and vegetative growth. So with azaleas, they are finicky. They have many triggers for flowering, and so things like EC or relative humidity, even pH or moisture, all things will kind of trigger them. And you want the flowering to be at the right time so that they all set at the same time, bloom at the same time, because we're selling an ornamental crop. Just as a reminder, humidity, for example, high humidity favors vegetative growth. Low humidity is for reproductive. We've seen that before. Again, kind of a conserved property in plants. Once rooted, you should be aware azaleas are what we call an iron inefficient crop. They demonstrate iron deficiencies pretty easily. So they're very pH sensitive. That's why we want them acidic. We want to keep them at the point where the iron is more available on the lower end. This other slide, oh gee, I can't go backwards. Why is that? Strange. Anyways, what it's showing is that the fertilizers in the list were showing potential acidity or basicity. We've mentioned that in root zone in the fall. I just wanted to remind you guys. Basically, the top part, the acidic fertilizers, are referring to the amount of tons of calcium carbonate to neutralize them. So obviously, the more calcium carbonate you need to neutralize, the more acidic potentially a fertilizer is. So 2177 needed like 800 some pounds per ton, which is a lot to neutralize them, which means it's very acidic. Anyways, their roots are fine, they're fibrous, which means that they're small, and small, delicate roots are always sensitive to burning. So it's important when you irrigate that there's always some water coming out the bottom. So you're leaching. You're not just adding as it dries and accumulating salts. It's important that you irrigate to the point where some water is coming out the bottom and you're displacing maybe some nutrients the plant didn't need, so that those excess ones don't accumulate and end up with a salt injury. Moisture levels yo-yoing, a big deal for azaleas. As a potted plant, they are one of the ones you got to water like 3 times a week. They do not like dry roots at all. If you're really finicky, they like warm, so a lot of the farms will heat their water just to keep them going. The rest is kind of typical, less feed in the winter. That makes sense. As far as light levels, if you go back to their original habit, the azaleas grow underneath trees typically, or in just the beginning of the treed areas in the mountain areas. And so they like less intense light. So we're looking at 400 micromoles per square meter per second, not more. Whereas in the summer in the greenhouse, you'll be getting 800 to 1500 micromoles. So we have to shade. So azaleas are typically got some sort of diffuse shading or heavy whitewash to keep them from stress. Pruning, yeah, that depends on what you want, right? Do you want a tree or a bush? But obviously at some point you got to pinch, just like with the hydrangea crop we saw. By pinching, we get more breaks. By more breaks, we get more buds. So that's the trick. Yeah, every few weeks you pinch, and you cannot pinch past 6-7 weeks before flowering, right? So that's just basically end of August. You're done pinching. Maybe early, but I would say you could probably go a little bit later. But basically, depending on where you're going to go into your cold treatment, 6-7 weeks back from that is when you stop. So there is some evidence that chemical pinching can be done, growth regulator wise. So before I was talking about just literally pinching cuttings, there are chemical triggers like Florel, which is ethylene, which will break apical dominance, but be careful. It says here, delays flowering. That's something you want to stay away from getting towards the end of your vegetative cycle. Cytokinin also increases branching. That's configure. As far as pruning goes, with azaleas you do a soft prune. So a soft prune means you're just removing the apical tip. You're not going past or back past leaves, past the apical tip going back, because that's going to take away your lateral meristems. So that's a hard pinch. Yeah, I think I'm gonna move on. There's a nice picture actually showing you've got your 1, 2, and 3 years growth, and you can see sort of where the apical scales have peeled off, leaving beside their abscission areas. So for that new growth, this is actually a lot of crops are like this. Grapes are like this. Your different years growth, berries, canes, although a lot of them come from the crown, but some are like this. So that's this year's growth. So let's say we're in our 3rd and final year, and we're going to remove the top ½ inch. That's your terminal bud to encourage all the laterals to form. So instead of having 1 flower, we're going to have 6. These would have formed if that was left, but they would have been less dominant, and the flowers would have been smaller and likely buried in the foliage. So initiating buds, this is something that for azaleas, I mean, every cultivar has like variations, but azaleas are really all over the map. They're quite bonkers. But so you've got factors like the cultivar, temperature, photoperiod, humidity, and then of course growth regulators. So let's look at that. So azaleas are facultative short day. So if you think back, facultative means that it's not required. So they're not obligate, they're facultative. So that means that short day photoperiod is going to help them initiate. It's not a requirement for them to initiate. Azaleas are across the board with initiation. Temperatures, photoperiod, nutrition, everything plays a role. So you got to get them just right. So going down the list here. So 8 weeks of short days after your vegetative growth for bud initiation. And a lot of times that means blackout. So you're looking at exaggerated photoperiod. So they go down to 8 hours to initiate buds. It's a pretty short day. So before you go into cold storage, you're going to basically give them their chunk of 8 hours, so 8 weeks of short photo period, and then you're going to move the entire crop into a cold storage facility to get that 1,000 hours in. Um, Typically, in that 8 weeks, they do not need a lot of light. Very little requirement. We're looking at DLIs of 1.7 to 2 for the entire day. Where in our darkest month of the year, we're like around 8, so very low light. So you're shading even at that point, which is pretty remarkable. Yeah, so once the buds are mature, the plants, you'll see the buds are kind of firmed up. They're a good size. Then they're going to go into the cooler at around 4 degrees Celsius for their 1,000 hours. If you go above 4 degrees Celsius, you'll have leaves that start to yellow because the plants are not, they're still physiologically active, even at 4 degrees. But above 4 degrees C, there's enough physiological activity that even though they're in a cooler and it's dark, they're going to start scavenging nutrients from the lower leaves and sucking them out, and the leaves will get yellow and then start falling off. So we got to keep it below 4 degrees Celsius. And in a cooler, that sounds like an easy thing to do. It's actually not. Because you can actually have freezing damage in parts of the cooler as you're trying to cool the entire facility. So it has to be well designed, have good airflow so that the 4 degrees Celsius is uniform, not freezing in front of the cooler and warm in the corners, right? PGRs, we mentioned this already a little bit. Cyclocell is another one. B9 is often used, but those things are, I mean, honestly, there really is all over the map as to which ones people use, and there's no real formula. I looked up some papers on, even recently, papers are coming off with lots of different ideas. It's a tricky thing. Trying to avoid pinches and that kind of stuff, but trying to cut back on labor. I mean, it can be done, but there's almost always a cost. So probably at this point, still sending people through to pinch and stuff like that is still going to be a better way to go. Okay, so looking at dormancy, traditionally we're looking at 6 weeks in the cooler. That's about your 1,000 hours. What is interesting is some research has shown that gibberellic acid will help break the dormancy. Now remember, this is something in Plant Science 1 hopefully you would have learned, that gibberellic acid is consistently shows it will help break dormancy, right? So things like seeds that don't want to germinate, you can soak them in gibberellic acid and they will germinate. Plants that need 1,000 hours of cooling to break dormancy, if you treat them with gibberellic acid, you can reduce, maybe not eliminate, but you can reduce the vernalization period. And that in azaleas turns out from 6 weeks down to 3 weeks, which is pretty good. It cuts it in half. Why is that a good thing? Well, running a cooler costs money. Running those big compressors is not cheap. So a lot of farmers have switched to doing a gibberellic acid. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you're spraying in the cooler. It means that you do 3 weeks of cold treatment, take them out, and then for the subsequent few weeks, anywhere from 3 to 5, depending on the variety and whatnot, you spray regularly with gibberellic acid, and that will continue to break the dormancy. And what you find is that it breaks the dormancy, but we actually get more even flowering because they're all triggered at once, and you get slightly larger flowers, which is never a bad thing. This is a chart from a paper that was published showing different combinations of treatments. And here we're looking at 4 weeks of long days and then 6 weeks of short days. With the plus here means gibberellic acid has been applied, which means our cooler period is cut down to 3 weeks instead of 6, which means ultimately we only need 140 days to finish flowering, and we have a slightly higher flower quality. So, interesting. My daughter's printing off all kinds of junk and making lots of noise. Sorry. So, there's your 1,000 hours. Once they're done, then we want to just force the flowers, right? That's as simple as pulling them out, putting them in the greenhouse, setting the temperature to spring-like conditions because you want to reproduce what the azaleas would expect, which means they've come through the winter, they've had their cold, now their spring is coming, the days are getting warmer, the photo period's getting longer. So you're looking at around 4 to 6 weeks, and then your flowers will begin to open. Some of the challenges we have with forcing azaleas is that when they get actively growing in the spring, they will try to put new shoots up. And in nature, this is kind of normal because they're just trying to get as big as possible to help take over the forest, right? But for ornamentally, we don't want that, because what will happen is the flowers will end up just be slightly below branches that are shooting past. So you have to go in and you have to prune. We try to keep the temperatures cooler, so you regulate the temperatures in your greenhouse to keep it from what we call bypass. That's where these branches shoot off. You're going to have the odd days where maybe you can't keep it cool enough. It depends. And so you choose varieties that are less prone to bypass, but it does happen. Daily washing with water, right? So here, daily washing with water can help buds open. Can you remember what that is? We talked about seeds and imbibing seeds with water because it washes away abscisic acid. So by syringing the plants, the abscisic acid from the bud scales is washed away, and you have that inhibition is reduced. It's also what gibberellic acid does. It tries to bypass that, but syringing with water also reduces abscisic acid, which will help with getting those buds open. So there's a kind of a summary sheet for the process. So starting with a vegetative stage, you're going to have long days, high nitrogen. Remember, we're not talking high ECs. We're talking high nitrogen relative to phosphorus, potassium, etc. We're just trying to encourage vegetative growth. Higher light, not high light, because remember, these are sub 4-story growing crops. So moderate light, but higher relative to reproductive. High humidity always encourages vegetative growth. With as far as when they've bulked up, you've finished your pinching, you're going to move them to reproductive. Let's say in your 3rd year, then you're going to give them 6 weeks of short days with blackout, so 8 hours photo period. Reduce the nitrogen input, lower the light levels, right? Lower humidity. It's just think that we're tricking the plant into thinking, okay, winter's coming. We're going to prepare you for that. After that, you roll them into the cooler. No light. If you do, I didn't mention this in the other slide, if you do go above 4 degrees Celsius or your cooler is such that there's a risk, you string low wattage light bulbs in the cooler, and you do a minimum 12-hour photo period with light bulbs. Nothing crazy. We're not talking about a lot of light here, but that will help keep the lower leaves active so they don't get green. Go yellow, I mean. And then, of course, after the cooler, we're going to do our gibberellic acid. So does that you have to decide if you're doing 6 weeks in the cooler or 3. What's your approach? You're going to spray gibberellic acid afterwards or not? If not, you need the full 6 weeks, maybe 7 for insurance. But either way, once they come out the cooler, you're going to bump the temperature up to, say, 18 during the day, 14 at night. Maybe even keep it down to 16 during the day, depending on the cultivar. You're looking at 4 to 8 weeks. And in the first 3-4 weeks, gibberellic acid, if you have gone that route. And of course, like I said, remove blind shoots, those bypass ones that will kind of upset the balance of your plant.